in halacha from being drafted into an army, which has many ramifications for today, but we're going to contextualize it. I don't think we'll finish all the sources today, as is our way. And next week we'll probably continue. And I actually wanted to, either next week or the week after, actually, go through a very important article by Rav Lichtenstein called The Ideology of Hesder, which looks at this question from a number of different angles. That will kind of round it off with that. After this, we're also going to, later on in the evening, discuss one thing, or what I think is one of the greatest challenges for the Jewish people in the diaspora today. And I'm happy to obviously hear your thoughts and take it from there. So in terms of the actual topic, the question of are Talmidei Chachamim required to be drafted into the army, or can they be exempted from being drafted into the army, is we most encounter that question today in Israel, where there are significant political tensions around this question of exempting the Talmidei Chachamim, as is well known. In general, the Haredi community are exempt from military service as long as they're studying full-time in yeshivot and kollelem until advanced ages, and then they're exempt entirely, although at that point as well, it's very difficult for them to integrate into the workforce, which was an arrangement that was begun by Ben Gurion in the 40s and has since grown into a blanket exemption. Every now and then it pops up into the news when there are new governments, because there's always questions about this issue. And most recently, in the last 2 to 3 years, has become even more, has become more of a significant issue, because the Supreme Court in Israel has ruled that arrangement is unconstitutional, essentially, and that essentially there needs to be change in that field. Until now, they haven't changed that. The government's come back and said, well, we're working on it, where we need to discuss. And as so often happens in Israel, actually what's going to happen is it'll just kind of work itself out based on what the Supreme Court decides, and the government won't actually decide, which is one way to operate. I'm not sure it's the best way to operate, but it really is a question. And as time goes on, there are larger numbers of Haredim that are exempt. And at the same time, the secular community are upset that essentially the Haredim don't serve in the army. And we're going to look at these claims, right? As we go through, we'll look at what the sides say, and but we're going to begin really from the beginning. Hi, Mr. Tabor. He's returned. So we're going to start from really the beginning, because this question actually needs a lot more context, right? And before we even get into the sources, and they are numerous, we need to understand the context, where this question comes from. It's a modern question, right? Only in the period of modernity does this even become really a question in Jewish thoughts, right? Obviously, there were armies in the Second Temple period, in the period of the Tanakh, and there were militaries, and even in Qumran, right, an area which I know a little bit about. There, they even believed that they were fighting a real battle for the end days. And obviously the righteous were the ones who were fighting the forces of evil. So this question is a modern one, because after the destruction of the Second Temple, and all the more so after the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, we have essentially a removal from the world of real military service in Jewish life until the modern period. And I'm going to just share my screen with you now. And it becomes a question. It's not really a question in the modern state of Israel. It's a question that that comes about in modernity, because in modernity, here I've got a nice picture of Haredi and the guy at the drafting center in Jerusalem, where I've been on occasion. And it's a question because when did people start fighting wars, right? We have this thought process. I think I spoke about this once a couple of years ago, almost in Shrubs, right? But, we have this concept of countries always were as they were. Everyone went to fight. The Jews didn't, because the Jews were always, outsiders in Europe and elsewhere, and the Jews didn't fight. And that's largely true, although even in medieval times, the knights were not really from the country. The knights were loyal to the king or the queen, and the king wasn't really necessarily from the country. They owned the lands based on various agreements and politics. And it's true, the peasants were taken out to fight, right? But it's not the same concept as a people's army, right, that we have today. This concept of we're going to fight for really king and country, right? We're going to defend, people went to fight wars for religious reasons, but they were taken kind of in a different way to I think, how it's done today. And so this question really starts to be asked when modern states are formed and when Jews need to become integrated into those states and when the countries start taking people to their militaries to serve, right? And so here's just a famous picture, which I'm sure many people know of Yom Kippur, I think in the German or Prussian army. I believe the emperor is there, right, at the Yom Kippur service. And you see masses of Jews davening on the front of what was the front. I think it's a picture from the 19th century. And so that's, at that point, you start getting these questions. Well, can the king take us to the army, right? Do we have to go? And in the case of some places, right, the Jews were simply given a quota, right? We need to take 4 people out of every 1,000. And you start getting these questions. Well, do we have a right to choose who we can take? Are scholars exempt? Who's exempt? And even in many non-Jewish circles, even today, there are exemptions for clergy, say, from participating in warfare, right? And so you enter this discussion only in modernity, right? Because Jews were never taken really to fight in the medieval times. They were ex-territoria. They paid their Jews, literally their taxes, to live where they lived, and as a community, and that was rather it. And so it's a question that's related to modernity. Here as well, I think I've shown this picture. I've definitely shown it in Manchester once or twice. And it's a famous picture of a Prussian soldier, returning from battle, right? And quite clearly his family's frum, right? There's Kiddush cup on the table. There's also the old, Yekish Shabbos lamps, if anyone knows what I'm talking about, right? And you can't see it, but in the picture up there is actually a picture of the emperor, right, or the king. And so again, this is part and parcel of modernity. You can see how the father is looking at the son's regalia, right? And it's really a question. So when we think about it in the context of Israel today, which is generally the context we think about, it's actually a much broader question, right? And is there a difference between Israel today or a Jewish state and a non-Jewish state? And that, of course, is an important question. Another element to consider, and this is actually quite important, I think, actually, I think it's overlooked, especially in the debate in Israel, is how some of this all sounds to Haredi ears in historical context, right? Because as you know, right, Jewish memory goes back a long way, right? I think not to be political, right, but Naftali Bennett, right, is the head of one of the right-wing religious party, the National Religious Party in Israel. He just said, we thank Mr. Trump for everything he did for us, and Jewish memory goes a long, long way. And what we see is when the Russians, right, this whole idea of the canton schools, where they forcibly draft people into the army across the empire, right, based on social standing. Certain people are exempt and other people a different number of years. And I think the Jewish community had to give a certain number, right? But this was a draft for 25 years, and children were taken to be educated in schools and raised in schools. Conversion was often forced upon them or heavily, children were heavily pressured to convert. And it was rightly seen as a threat to the future of Judaism, right? And the Russians also saw it as that, right? They saw it as a way to make people loyal, but also make people, the soldiers which we want, right? And that was how it was viewed. And so, when secular people today in Israel talk about, we have to draft the Haredim, right? Because they need to become part of us. They have to, they need to move with the times, right? To a Jewish ear that's historically aware. And obviously, I'm not comparing the Cantonist regime in Tsarist Russia, chas v'shalom, to the state of Israel. I'm sure you'll know where my sentiments lie in that sense, right? And I'm sure at the end of this year, if you don't know that, at the end of this year, you'll definitely know where my sentiments lie, right? But to an ear, you start hearing, oh, okay, so the draft in Israel is like the Cantonists, right? Is that what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to change us. You're trying to destroy Torah, right? And so again, I'm not saying it's the same. It's in fact, I think it's the opposite, right? But you need to be sensitive, right, on a practical level before you start talking about, halacha and ethics. You need to be sensitive to that, and that's also part and parcel of this question of the military, right, which is a modern question, which is, how do we tell, make everyone citizens, and then we tell them you have to be part of the military away from your home, and you need to, it becomes difficult, and there are certain questions which arise, also halachic questions, but also just in general in being around the military. It's not an ideal place by any stretch of the imagination, right? So that's just kind of to provide historical context before we even get into this question, right? Does anyone want to say anything before we carry on or comment?
I've seen recently in the Jewish Weekly, there are always questions posed to ask the rabbi, what's his name, Shochet?
Okay.
And one of the questions was, my son wants to be in the British Army. Oh. It's a halachic problem with it. He gave a response to this, which probably says among the lines the same, but you're saying that he basically says there's a huge difference between Israeli army and any other army in the world, simply because of the practical halachic implications. And also, he doesn't go into the whole spirit of fighting, being a part of a nation, or what Rav Kook set out in his works, like contributing to the Jewish nation, protecting Jews. Didn't speak about it at all, only about the halachic point of view, that it's easier to keep kashrut, to even learn, have a daf yomi in the Israeli army, which you can't have really so much in a foreign army.
Right, I mean, well, we'll see. It's not so pashut. Even for a foreign army, it's not so pashut to say that. And we'll see. We'll get the immune sessions. Anyone else want to say anything? No. Good. I'm not in Cherem yet, so that's good for Manchester. But let me just reshare. Sorry. What happened? Sorry. Okay, sorry, I just have an issue with my screen. Here. Okay. Okay. So the first source, when we're looking at halacha, or we're looking at, what's the Jewish approach to this question, is famously Bamidbar, Lamed Bet, Vav, when, Bnei Gad and Reuven, they want to go and take parts of their Yarden. And the famous quote from Moshe Rabbeinu, which is, V'yomer Moshe Bnei Gad u'Bnei Reuven, Ha'acheichem yavo l'milchama v'atem teshvu po. Right? And it's a question. Rashi says it's bitmia. It said as a question, will your brothers go before you in battle and you'll sit here? Which is a basic, right? I don't even think you need the Torah to have that pasuk, right? And they say, of course not. We'll go first to make sure and make clear that that's not our intention, right? We're going to go first and fight, and then we're going to come back. We're going to do our obligation to the nation, and then we're going to do then we're going to come back and take land. That isn't part of our shikul. I don't think it is tied necessarily to halacha. It's tied to basic ethics, right? Basic obligation, basic morals, right? Right. We will fight because everyone's fighting. Everyone's going out to war, right? And so that is obviously a beginning, and an important beginning, I think, which needs to be in the back of our minds when we have this discussion. But having said that, it's not so clear, right? Because we do know in Dvarim, there are exemptions listed for the army, right? It's not necessarily that everyone goes to fight all the time, perhaps. We'll see in a second. And so I'll just read it. Devarim Kaf says like this, V'dibro shotrim, it's explaining what happens at the beginning of a battle, right? V'dibro shotrim el-am le'emor, right? And the officers go around to the nation saying, Mi ha'ish asher bana bayit chadash v'lo chancho yelech v'yeshev leveito ben yamud milchama v'ish acher yechanchenu. Right? Who has built a new house and hasn't yet dedicated it, hasn't yet used it properly, let him go home in case he dies in war, and another man will come and take it. The same with a vineyard, the same with someone who has become betrothed to someone. And that's what they say. And then they go on saying, right? And they keep on saying, who is someone who is fearful and weak of heart, perhaps, or soft of heart? He should go and return to his home so that he doesn't cause the hearts of others to withdraw or to melt or to become weakened like his. And perhaps that's how we need to understand the entire concept of the pshat of these psukim, is the concern of the Torah is if there's someone on the battlefield who doesn't really want, who has a deep kind of concern about being there, it can lead to decay essentially of the fighting force. And there's a problem. That's perhaps the pshat. We do see that there is a concept of exemptions, even in the Torah, from going out battle some kinds of battles. And by the way, this is I remember when I joined the army. So one of the things one of my rebbeim in yeshiva spoke about, right, is the famous Rambam that says when you go into battle, you need to not be scared and put thoughts of your family and everything out of your mind and go and fight, because you need to fight. You need to do Ratzon Hashem. Right, and so this whole thing is actually quite realistic, or is quite relevant, right? But anyway, you see here that there are cases of exemptions. Okay, but moving on to Sotah, right? The famous one of the famous Mishnayot that's brought in this case, and we'll just begin it. We'll read the Mishnah only, and we'll read just parts of it so we understand, right? And it's talking about our psukim. Right, and it quotes what we just quoted. The officers continue talking to the nation. Right, anyone who's fearful and soft of heart, it means its simple meaning. He can't really stand, right, in battle, in the difficulties of battle. He can't see a sword being drawn, and that person, right, it really is kipshat, right? Someone who can't really go to battle, it's not worth you being there, right? It's going to bring down the rest of the army, and anyone who's been in situations, not even of the military, right? But we all know that working as a team, especially in something which is highly intensive and highly stressful, what it means when you see someone slip away, right? And what that does to the rest of the team. But then there's another opinion. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, right? What does it mean, someone who is faint or weak of heart? Right? This is someone who is scared about the averot that he has, right? So that, according to Rabbi Yossi, he goes home, right? Therefore, the Torah gave him all of these other exemptions, right? That the three that came before, anyone who, the shotrim come, the officers come, say anyone who has made a house and hasn't yet entered it, has done a vineyard, etc., you can leave. And then the person who's very concerned about his averot, he's concerned he won't be successful in battle because he has nothing to protect him with. He leaves, right? And no one knows who's who because they all leave at the same time. But that's the concern. The concern is that there is a question, right, of averot, or someone having sins, not being protected, and therefore also perhaps having a weak heart and not being really prepared for battle. A concept of that the camp of the military needs to be holy, right? Not only physically, but also spiritually, right? That there's a sense that also our actions dictate what's going to happen in war. And I'm only reading this out because it's interesting, I think, of itself, this machloket from Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And we'll see later as well, what's the ideal? Not only the question is, are Torah scholars exempt from military service, or can they be exempt? But when we read Rav Lichtenstein's article on the ideology of Hesder, right, we're going to ask ourselves, well, what's the ideal, right? What does it mean to be a Machaneh Kadosh? Perhaps there's an extra obligation on Talmidei Chachamim to be there, but that's when we get more political. No, but I'm saying that's when we read Rav Lichtenstein. But that'll be a week next week, I think. And then it goes on and discusses, and then it says these important lines, right? We saw that there were these exemptions given in Devarim, right? Anyone who built a house, anyone who got betrothed, etc. Oh, there's machloket in the halacha. What happens if you're betrothed and then you get called to battle, you get called to battle, then you get betrothed? We're not going to talk about it. But it says here, when it says, you have these options to be exempted, b'milchamot hareshut, in wars that are not compulsory, right? That are not chiyuvim from the halacha, right? Aval b'milchamot mitzvah, but a milchama that is obligatory wars. It's according to Torah, it's a mitzvah to go fight. Hakol yotzin, everyone goes out to fight. Afilu chatan michedro, even a groom from his wedding chamber, the kala mechupata, even a bride from her chuppah. And by the way, there's a big discussion whether women are obligated or exempt, and according to this, they would be obligated, although quite clearly some of the poskim talk about that they're obligated not to fight, they're obligated to help in the fight and do other things. But anyway, we'll put that aside a second. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, b'med v'mori, b'milchamot mitzvah, b'milchamot chova, hakol yotzin, afilu chatan michadro, etc. Right? And we're not going to talk about the difference between milchamot reshut and milchamot mitzvah, right? But you see here that according to the Mishnah, according to Chazal, the exemptions only apply when you're talking about a war to expand territory, right? Where the king of Israel comes and says, this year we're going to conquer Syria, right? If Syria isn't part of Eretz Yisrael, we're not discussing that for the time being, right? We're going to go and expand our territory. We're going to go, and once upon a time, obviously, warfare was very different, was perceived very differently. It was just part of the way of doing business. And kings went out every year to fight battles, right? That's what they did. That's how they raised taxes and raised money and declared their greatness, right? That was, and until very recently, that was the concept of war. Only in the last maybe 100 years has war. Obviously, war was always terrible, but that was the idea of war, right? In the last 100 years, has war been seen as something which is only of necessity, only for defense, right? And what's a milchemet mitzvah? What's a milchemet chova? Where either Am Yisrael is under attack, or where you need to destroy some of the nations, the 7 nations, or Amalek, right? That's a milchemet mitzvah that you have to go out and fight. In such cases, there are no exemptions according to the Mishnah, right? According to the Mishnah. Does anyone have any comments or questions at this point? No. Good. Okay. However,
Ravari, just to ask, so Israel's defensive wars now, would they be viewed as milchemet mitzvah?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
which would obviously obligate everyone.
Without a doubt. We'll talk about this more. I heard once Rav Hershel Shechter in a kotel talk about the fact that today, in 1948, when everyone was fighting, literally everyone was fighting, there were 10-year-olds running around passing messages in the old city of Jerusalem, right? That's a milchemet mitzvah. But today, where not everyone goes to fight anyway, and you don't really need everyone, so then it's not necessarily the same geder as you need everyone there, right? You need everyone there. So when I was in that shiur, my friend David Bradsmith puts up his hands. I wasn't in the army with Bradsmith, but he was here above me. And he said, but Rav Shechter, when I was in the army, we had, by the way, don't tell anyone this, we had 15 guard boxes around the base on the border, and only 10 of them were manned. And when I asked them why, they said, because we don't have the manpower. So again, obviously these questions are for people greater. And he said, well, if that's the case, then everyone has to go, right? If that's the case. But again, these things are very intricate. What we're talking about here is ikroni, right? In principle. What is the din? When it comes to the intricacies, these are important as well, I think, right? To think about, well, is that really the case that everyone has to go today to the Israeli army? But then if that's the case, then I'll respond and say, well, why the Haredim exempt, right? What would be the best is everyone gets a year in Kollel. That's actually be very good for everyone in Israel. You know what I mean? The Haredim get a year, the Chilonim, everyone will be good, great for, you know. The problem with that, of course, is that then the Jews for Jesus also want their Kollel, right? And then it'll be a whole balaga. But that's a whole other thing. Anyway, so that is the kind of case for why it's a chovah to go to the army, right? It's clear you need to go to the army. And obviously the advent of the state of Israel brings with it its own issues. Firstly, as we've seen before, the question of Zionism, anti-Zionism, secular Jews, etc., where this state isn't the ideal. So is it within the realm of the Jewish people fighting a war? And again, most people I think would say that it is, right? It's not, but that is part and parcel of this entire question. And just before we kind of we'll do another couple of sources, and then we'll probably end off and move on to the other discussion. I actually have to go and get some things for the Tu B'Shvat L'Chaim, but there are other sources, right? It's not all of one cloth, so to speak, which is important. And I think out of intellectual honesty, and also for ourselves, we need to understand what it says. And I will even add at this point that you should know that not every Datilumi Rav or Posek has said that everyone should be drafted, right? In fact, and we'll see what they say. Part of the reason why Ben Gurion decided to give the first 400 exemptions to Torah learners was because of the chief rabbi and the head of the Mizrahi that said we need those learners, we need them to be learning. And so it is more complex, and part of it is based on what we see here, but part of it is also obviously tied to the Shoah and the destruction of Jewish culture. But here it says, they're talking in Bava Batra about the obligations a city can impose on the residents, right, for the upkeep of the city, right? Whenever you have, you need to pay for the guard, you need to build a wall, perhaps, you need to dig for water, and there are all kinds of questions about, can we force people to pay? Can we force orphans to pay? What about rabbis, right? What about scholars? And so one of the questions is about who pays for the wall of the city, right? Ikadamri. There are those who say, "By mine Rabbi Elazar, mi Rabbi Yochanan," right? There are those who say, "Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Yochanan." I've got the English here if you want to follow along as well. Shen govim lefi kiruv batine govim, or dilma lefi mamon govim, right? When they collect money to build the wall, do they collect based on the proximity of the houses to the wall, right? Based on who's going to need the wall more, right? Or perhaps they base it based on the net worth of every, the amount of money they have, right? So everyone gives equally. Right? He says they collect based on the proximity of houses. And my son fixed nails in this, right? Set it up, right? But now we get to the question. I brought that just so you know, because it's important to understand the context. Right? Whenever you read Gemaras, you can always pull out a line to say whatever you want. The question is, what's the Gemara talking about? Right? And so you see, it's talking about who is required to pay and who pays more. So we're not talking about a country, we're talking about a city, but it's important. Rabbi Yehuda and Sia, right? Ramad Ashura ad Rabbanan. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right? Rabbi Yehuda Sia, right? Once imposed payments of the wall on the rabbis, on the Talmidei Chachamim in the city. Right? He says the sages don't require protection. He brings a pasuk, and we're not going to go through the midrash, but it comes out that the Torah learners do, they're righteous, and more than that, just to carry on the hemshech, the carry on of the midrash. Just like, we're not going to get into the midrash, right? But just like sand protects the sea, right? Protects from the sea. Ma'asem shel tzadikim, right? The deeds of the righteous, shem merubim lo kol sheken shemeginim aleim, right? The deeds of the righteous protect them, and therefore, according to this, the chachamim don't need protection, right? And therefore, they don't need to pay for the wall. right? It's being built in the city. So how could you levy the other? And that Gemara, if you want to see more inside there, goes into greater detail and discusses other instances, like it's talking about digging a well for water. And there you do mechayev the rabbis, because the rabbis need also to drink water, right? But by the wall you don't, because they don't need protection. But interestingly, there you see the discussion before was the houses that are closer to the wall that need the protection more, and the houses that are further away from the wall, you pay relative to where they are. So too, you would say Talmidei Chachamim don't require the protection, so they don't need. So that is one of the sources which says, well, actually, Talmidei Chachamim bring something that others don't, perhaps to protection of cities, so to speak. And so on that note, we'll end, because we have to move on. But we see here that it's complex, right? There are a whole, like always, there are a whole lot of questions which come into this. You also have the historical context, right? You also have that it's a modern thing, it's a new thing, we need to deal with the new thing. You also have the question of, everything that happened in Europe, right? And everything that happened, Jews being drafted, was that a good thing? Was that not a good thing? We'll see next week some of the Achronim, like Rav Hirsch, who talks about that, yes, it's a good thing. The Jews should go and defend the country, right? And that obviously is very appropriate for Rav Hirsch and his entire philosophy of Oral Goyim, and his entire philosophy about the country and the Malchut and the role of Jews. The role of Jews is never to have political power, but to support the country, because the country essentially allows the Jews to do their work, right? And so when it comes, getting to the question that Daniel mentioned in terms of, well, what about England today? So Rav Hirsch didn't think that. Rav Hirsch thought that the Jews should go and defend the country, right? That picture that you saw of the Jew coming back on Shabbos from the war, right? That was in that spirit, right? Someone who was proud to go and fight for the emperor, the Caesar, or whoever, the Caesar, whoever it was, the Kaiser, whoever it was, right? And so we'll see, all those things come into it, but together with that, in the background of the sources, right, the kind of basic sources of what you do to fight a war, which those only really apply to Malchut Yisrael, as we'll see. They only really apply to the Jews when it's a Jewish country, a Jewish monarchy. Together with that, there is this sense in the Gemara that Talmidei Chachamim bring with them a certain level of security for the city, right? The Talmidei Chachamim themselves are protected, right? And that is part and parcel of this entire discussion. And so next week, we're going to go on and see a few more sources, particularly the Rambam. It's a very famous source in Hilchot Shemitah that's often quoted in this regard. And then we're going to go on and see some of the modern day sources discuss draft in general, particularly draft in Israel. We're going to look at the Chazon Ish, the Khatam Sofer, Ben Gurion will be in there, and also the Mizrahi rabbis that don't necessarily think draft should be obligatory. And we'll take it from there. Does anyone have any comments or questions?
I was just say it seems to be related to a question which kind of comes up at the moment about coronavirus, which is, like, as Jews, what is our obligation vis-a-vis the state and the wider society? Do we just view ourselves as a community, being an island, or looking after ourselves, or do we view ourselves as being part of the wider society? I think the problem in Israel with the Haredi draft is that the Haredim don't want to be part of Israeli society, and therefore that which we view as something positive to contribute to the state, they view as something negative.
Yeah, Hinami, I agree with you. If you want to see something very interesting, I'll post it to the group. Actually, I don't know if I can, but I'll post it to the group. If for those that understand Hebrew, there's a Frum reporter called Yair Shirki, right? And he just did a bit on what he called the laws of the games of the Haredim, and he went and interviewed 3 different Haredi families. One who's like an Avrech who learns, he becomes Rosh Kollel. Another one who is in learning, then goes out to work. And a third family is very modern, right? Very similar to Haredi kind of families, they're like the modern families in Manchester. And he talks to them about their values and about what they think. It's very, very interesting to see that. And at one point in that, it's like 15 minutes. At one point in that series, he says to the guy, the Kollel guy who becomes Rosh Kollel, And he says, no, you guys want autonomy. You want to be an autonomous zone in a state, have your own state, and do that. Just say it and have it, or you won't. But that you just say that's what you want. And he said, and he says, no, we can't do that because we need people we need people who are not only learners, right? So he says, yeah, you see, that's what the Chilonim will say to you, that you need people, you can't do it. And he's like, yeah, we agree. There needs to be people who are in the army, but there need to be people who are learning. And so it's interesting what he was arguing. I personally don't buy it. That's like, I agree with you. Essentially, the Haredi mindset is, the official mindset is anti-Zionist, right? And so they don't want to be part of the state, but they need the state. And so it becomes very complicated for them, I think, in terms of arguing it ideologically. But what he was saying there was, no, yeah, we believe, the Chilonim will fight and we'll learn and we'll both do our job. So again, what I'm trying to say is not as clear cut, I think, as you presented it, even though I agree with what you're saying, right? I think if you ask like an ideological Haredi, a learner in Kollel, he might say that, no, we need you learn and we fight, we fight, you learn, and but we'll leave that perhaps for next time, I think. So I'll just pause it now. If anyone wants to go, feel free. I'm just going to go get some of the Tu B'Shvat things. That were just to do a quick l'chaim before we go on to the challenges of Am Yisrael today. So hold tight or not. If I don't see you, have a good one. I'll be back in a second.